back to my YouTube channel. Apologies for the long hiatus. I was quite busy with university and I've recently just got my holidays and finished work, so that's why I'm back, and hopefully I'll be posting a lot more consistently now. In this video I'm going to be filming my walkthrough for question 2 of A-level English language OCR paper 1. So this is the second question that you see in paper 1, where you kind of have to write either an article or it can be the transcript to a podcast, it can be a speech, so you can get various different sort of formats that you can be asked to write in. So I'll be doing a walkthrough of this particular question, which I sat in 2023. Just for context, I got 21 out of 24 for this question. To break it down, for AO2 I scored a total of 11 out of 12, and for AO5 I scored a total of 10 out of 12. And just to re-jog your memories a little bit, AO2 is demonstrate critical understanding of concepts and issues relevant to language use, and AO5 is demonstrate expertise and creativity in the use of English to communicate in different ways. So I'm just going to give sort of a walkthrough and kind of explain and give a little bit of understanding as to how I did this. Also for a bit of context and just to kind of give you a bit of reassurance, I do write professionally outside of my education. I get paid to write. I don't do it very often because I do study full time, but even as somebody who does that and who works kind of in that industry, I do, it was really difficult, and I struggled as well, and because it's different writing, for newspapers or professionally or online or whatever it is, and then sort of doing that in the exam and kind of delivering what they want as examiners. So those are two different things, but I will try my best to sort of impart that knowledge and give the tips and tricks that will really help you guys. So just before I start, the question was, since regional accents can be a disadvantage in life, schools owe it to their pupils to encourage them to speak with received pronunciation. Write a script for the presenter or presenters of a local radio show who will critically debate this statement. You should aim to engage a reasonably well-educated, non-specialist audience. Your script should be no more than 500 words. And you have about 45 minutes to spend on this section. So I'm going to read it through, and then as I'm going through, I'm going to give commentary and sort of more context. Okay, you may have heard people talking about the English language like it's a thing to be kept pretty. A petticoat that might be sullied by the rise of glottal stops, slang and rogue grammar. The latest to add their 2 cents is writer Jonathan Meades, who argued that received pronunciation, that's Queen's English for those of you who may not be familiar with RP, is the glue uniting our country and should be celebrated as a tool for social mobility. In today's show, we're going to discuss whether RP really can be touted as a tool for social mobility when up and down the country, reports are emerging of schools repressing regional accents. Sorry, I was just struggling there a little bit with my handwriting and what I'd actually written there. Right, so in this particular paragraph, it's really important, and one thing that we were always taught is that you have to really, throughout the piece, keep in mind what you're writing. What is the genre that you're writing? Is it an article? Is it a script? Is it for a TV show? Is it for a podcast? What is it for? And in this case, obviously, it's a written piece of work, and it's for a local radio show, and you have to keep that in mind, because when you're writing for sort of speech, it's going to be different than when you're writing an article. Okay, and it's obviously going to be more sort of I guess a little bit more informal, but it's not going to be completely or overly informal, because at the end of the day, it's still going to have that element of you're trying to educate people, you're trying to sort of maintain that professionalism and that professional integrity of that local radio show. So in this case, how have I sort of tailored it to show that it is actually a script, show the examiner that I am writing sort of a script and that I'm not just writing an article. So the way that I've sort of done that is that I've sort of used direct address. So you, and I've used that throughout. So I've said, you may have heard, and sort of things like that. And then I've sort of say, in today's show, we're going to discuss. So again, I'm referencing the Today's Show. So I'm sort of using synthetic personalization over there. I'm using elision. So I'm saying we're rather than saying we are. So, we are might be used in sort of more formal writing, which isn't the case here. I'm also sort of using metaphors and sort of almost like satirical language when I'm saying, a thing to be a petticoat that might be sullied by the rise of glottal stops, slang and rogue grammar. And obviously even that sort of the rule of 3 that I've used there, the glottal stops, the slang, the rogue grammar. So that's also sort of really powerful, because that's more of something to sort of hook the audience. And then I've said the latest to add their 2 cents. So that's sort of that's a saying that we sort of have in the English language, and again it's more sort of an informal saying. And then I've obviously referenced the writer Jonathan Meades, and that's really important that throughout your sort of question, and particularly for this question, that you're sort of having little tidbits and ideas in your back pocket that you can sort of bring out, and then you can use them in your article, because that's how you sort of show the examiner that you're engaged with current sort of facts and information, things that are going on in the media, and it's really important to have those sort of anecdotes and analogies and quotes to use in your sort of answer, because not only does it sort of help you to bulk out the answer and to sort of properly form it and sort of get a thread running through that, it also makes it more interesting, it makes it more engaging. It also shows that obviously you've been doing your homework and that you know what you're doing. And again, obviously here I've said I've used that term received pronunciation, right? And it's really important. Again, our teachers emphasise this again and again. They said that if you're going to use something, you're using sort of technical language that we would be taught in the classroom, for example, it's really important then that you explain or put it in brackets, or that you give a definition of what that means and what that is, because obviously the audience isn't going to know that. And if you're including lots and lots of jargon and lots of really technical, difficult language that is hard for the audience to access, then obviously you're going to get penalised for that. So try not to use too many bits of terminology. It shouldn't sound like it's the curriculum from OCR. It shouldn't sound like that. And that if you are using a couple of, it's important to obviously use a couple of sort of phrases throughout. So obviously you're showing that technical expertise that you have as a student. But then when you are using it, make sure that you are very clearly and simply explaining what it means and breaking it down for the audience, so that it's accessible to them and understandable to them. Okay, moving on to the next paragraph. The bias that speakers of regional accents face is something that linguists call accentism. And it just so happens that some of the most powerful people in our country uphold accentism, including former Education Secretary Michael Gove, who associated non-RP English with joblessness. Yes, some of you may remember this is the same man who was fired from his position as head of education. The head of the national curriculum also echoed Gove's statement, saying regional English was sloppy. Okay, so over here, I've literally prefaced, rather than saying accentism is da-da-da, I've literally prefaced it with the bias that speakers of regional accents face is something that linguists call accentism. So I've made it really simple in literally just under 2 sentences, 2 lines, what that is, okay? And then obviously I've started my next sentence over here with, and it just so happens, so obviously I'm using here a prefrontal connective or conjunction, and that obviously in more formal sort of pieces of text that wouldn't happen, or that wouldn't be appropriate to use, but here it is because it's a script for spoken language. And so obviously I've sort of I've used accentism, then I've continued that throughout here. And then obviously I've made a reference to Michael Gove. Again, that's something that's current, that's something that's topical. And obviously I'm sort of bringing in sort of the fact that he's associated with joblessness. Now, obviously I don't... in this article, obviously, I'm going to argue a certain point, and obviously I'm trying to sort of bring in, it's really important that throughout your articles you try to bring in counter-arguments. So if you're sort of talking about whatever topic it is, it might be accentism, it might be to do with language change, it might be to do with language in the media, it might be to do language and gender, whatever it is. Try and have sort of 2 points and 2 sides of the argument and cover both of the perspectives, whether it's left wing, right wing, whatever the types of politics it is, male versus female, whatever it is. Try and bring in both, even if it's not what you agree with. By bringing in the other side of the argument, you can actually show that you can create a balanced argument and that you can consider both sides. And that shows insightfulness, thoughtfulness, this sort of balanced, measured approach that you're taking to the question. And in this situation, obviously, I don't want to say, as the writer or as the host of this show, quote unquote, I don't want to particularly say that it's sloppy, right? But obviously, I've then used Michael Gove or the head of the national curriculum to, I've used them as examples, so then I can bring that idea in without sort of making it sound like I'm sort of perpetuating those ideas. So again, and this is something that both of them, have said, it's not something that I've just made up on the spot. So again, having those, and it's really easy just to remember those little tidbits. So having that sort of allows me to then create sort of a counter argument and consider all sides of the conversation. Now, some of you may be thinking that these are just silly throwaway comments, but the truth is they have far-reaching consequences, as shown by the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which argues language shapes our views and beliefs. It's the sentiment pushed by people like Gove that creates the dominant ideology that regional accents are somehow inferior. The dominant ideology is a set of mainstream beliefs that society as a whole buys into, a bit like the idea that charity at Christmas is a must. And studies actually showed that strong northern accents are viewed as less intelligent and less educated compared to RP. So there you can really see how the dominant ideology and the language used to create it shapes our views. So this paragraph, I've got, obviously you can see an AO5 award for that. So the way that I've done, so for example, I've said now. Some of you may. So again, some of you, I've done, I'm directly addressing the audience. I'm using direct address with that pronoun you. I said now. Again, that's a sort of bit informal. So I'm bringing sort of the audience into the current moment because obviously this might be live. And then I've said silly throwaway comments. So again, that's sort of colloquial language. But the truth is, so again, I've done a prefrontal conjunction here. So again, that's a bit informal, a bit conversational. And then I've talked about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis here. And I don't know about you guys, but for us, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis was something that it was a really basic kind of theory that we were taught in lesson. It wasn't something really complicated or complex or really highly technical. It was quite a simple theory that we were taught. But obviously here I've quite cleverly sort of brought it in, and it can be something, and that goes to show that you don't have to have you don't have to sort of go out and memorize and look at research papers and articles and journals and go and look at this really complicated research and memorize it page by page. No, it can even be these simple sort of things that your teachers are telling you about that you can take, and then you can bring it in and quite cleverly sort of weave them into the argument. And again, I've sort of explained it argues that language shapes our views and beliefs. And then obviously because I thought, okay, well, this is just one hypothesis, this is just one theory, I wanted to bring in something else. So then I brought in this idea about the dominant ideology, which again is not a very complicated concept, but the fact that I've obviously explained it in a way and then I've linked it up with the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, it can just make that paragraph just a little bit nicer. And I've got the AO5 point for that as well. And then again over here I've talked about studies, but if I just started talking about studies and research, it might get a little bit boring. It is, after all, a radio show, so I've done and studies showed. So again, making it a little bit more conversational, and then I've talked about the strong northern accents and how they're viewed as less intelligent and less educated. So just these quotes, and that means that I've included those quotes from the research, but I've made that research really accessible to everybody because everybody would understand what less educated, less intelligent means. And then I've obviously gone on to sort of double down and said, so here you can really see how the dominant ideology and the language used to create it shapes our views. Again, you, direct address, our views, synthetic personalization. So again, it's sort of constantly bringing in that audience all the time. Then moving on to the next paragraph, I want you to think back to your days in the classroom. Were you ever told that you weren't talking right? And how did it make you feel? Because decades on, we're still in the same place. Schools are banning words like ain't, was, and gonna. They're forcing children to upwardly converge. That basically means that the children are being told to leave their regional accents and dialects behind and speak in the standard form. Why is this being done, you might think? Well, in part because of accent snobbery and accentism, but also because people fear that children who deviate from RP in speech won't then be able to write fluently and articulately. So again, I want you to think back. So I'm sort of personalizing, that's the first person pronoun. You is that second person pronoun, direct address. So I'm sort of creating that relationship between the audience, so I and you, and getting them to think back to their days in the classroom. You're giving them sort of direct instructions. And then, were you ever told that you weren't talking right, and how did it make you feel? So I'm directly rhetorical questions that I'm asking to the audience. I'm getting them to think and ponder. And then I'm talking about how we're still, decades on, we're still in the same place. So again, there's a synthetic personalization. And then I've used sort of the examples, they're banning words like ain't, was, gonna. And then I could have just kind of said, they're banning these words, and that, and then I could have gone straight onto this part about why is this being done? It's because of accent snobbery and accentism. But rather than doing that, I've obviously included this bit. Well, the fact that they're banning these words, that banning itself is upward convergence, right? And literally just by describing that in a technical way, I've scored a point there. So even the simple things, we have terminology and things like that we can use to describe, technically, and then use that language, bring that in, and then just say what it is. So obviously I said it straight away, I explained that what it basically means, right? And literally even using that sort of adverb basically helps to sort of put it in the reader's mind, okay, actually, this isn't a really difficult concept that I've just mentioned. It's quite accessible to understand. And it means that obviously you're not going to get penalised by the examiner for using language that's too difficult to understand. And obviously I've got the AO2 score over here, the AO5 point over here. Well, I have news for you. That's simply not true. ... In fact, linguist David Crystal, who we'll be inviting onto the show soon, argue that children are experts at code switching. This essentially means that they're savvy enough to change their language according to the situation that they're in. It's why we don't see a regional speech entering into GCSE essays or job interviews. So again, well, I have news for you. That's a very sort of typical sort of statement, and again, it's very sort of colloquial. And then the fact that I've referenced David Crystal, and then I said we'll be inviting onto the show soon. So again, throughout this article, I've not just then started off at the beginning and said welcome to today's show and then completely forgotten and not referenced the show. I've sort of brought that in again. So throughout the article, kind of making those little nods towards the fact that it is a written script and keeping that going throughout. The truth about RP is that it's actually a tool for inequality. It's the only form of spoken English that's determined by socioeconomic factors rather than geographical location, according to The Guardian. And only 15% of the British population speak RP. Is it surprising that 15% are also the richest 15%? So at a time where inequality is already rife in our society, we don't need to weaponise RP against our children and use it as a tool of punishment. And that's all for today, folks. Thank you for tuning in, and don't forget to share your thoughts on Twitter using hashtag RP in schools and the hashtag hashtag the Today Show. So again, I've sort of made that point over here in this paragraph, made my concluding points, and then I've gone on to sort of those facts and data. I've obviously quoted those, remembered them, and then rather than again, if I had just written them down, it could be very boring. I could have said 15 data and studies have shown that but I've said, is it surprising that, and I'm sort of getting a reaction out of people because I'm sort of talking about, look at this shock factor, look at this, it's can we believe it, and then we've talked about inequality being rife in society, and sort of evoking those emotions within people, and then at the end I said, that's all for today, folks. And it, again, that's returning back cyclical kind of structure. We're returning back to the genre of the piece, the fact that it is a script, and then bringing in sort of the social media aspect, hashtag RP, hashtag the Today Show. So again, sort of making a nod to the changing sort of and evolving sort of nature of radio shows, the fact that we do now have social media accounts, and the fact that people do sort of use Twitter. At that time it was called Twitter, now it's called X, and sort of making that nod, whereas maybe 20, 30 years ago people wouldn't necessarily use social media and post on Twitter or X or Threads or whatever it is. So that's kind of the piece concluded. I do have quite a lot of a whole sort of stack of articles here that I practiced in the lead up to my A-levels, and I can also share those if anybody's interested, although they are sort of physical copies with my terrible handwriting on them, but I can always share them and sort of go through them, and they've also been marked by my teachers who are also examiners, so that'll also be some useful feedback that I can give, but sort of the advice that I would kind of give is at the end of this article, and I can sort of answer any other questions in the comments, is that kind of try and practice as much as you can, and the reason that I was able to remember all these bits and pieces and information facts is because I kind of tried to, before my A-level exams, I had obviously practiced and written an answer for all the questions that I could find, in the previous years, but then I'd also sort of come up with new questions. I'd ask my teachers, okay, what do you think? Is there anything you can predict? What, in your experience as an examiner, what patterns of questions tend to come up? What do you hear at the meetings when you go for the big OCR meetings in the head office or whatever? And I kind of like doing that, and kind of thinking what I sort of searching online, hearing what people have written, and coming up with those questions. Now it's even better because you've got AI, you've got ChatGPT, and I'm obviously not telling you to use ChatGPT to write articles. I'm saying that you can sort of input the questions and say, okay, what questions could you give me practice questions that I could use to practice, then writing and then write your own response. And what I'd also say is that obviously I would write different. So I'd write for language and gender. I'd write for obviously spoken language, language change, language in the media, so all different types of articles, language technology. Also, I'd play around with different sort of concepts. So in this particular article, I've talked about sort of convergence, I've talked about accentism, I've talked about RP. You can obviously talk about prescriptivism, descriptivism in different sort of articles. Other articles over here, I've talked about political correctness. I've talked about another thing. What's another thing that I've talked about? Let's have a little look. So So actually, even so, for example, so here I've talked about sort of linguistic revolution, and social media and how that's influenced language and things like that, and how fast language is changing, obviously, because we do live in sort of a globalized world. So yeah, I can sort of go over any of those if anybody would be interested. Hopefully that was helpful. And I just wanted to show you my OneNote over here. Obviously, the screen sharing is only showing one part, unfortunately, because of the way it's positioned. I'll change that for next time. But I also had a section in sort of my OneNote where I sort of had compiled sort of a list of articles and things like that I could possibly use. There's not that many in here. There's obviously other sections. And sort of through using this list, I then, had ideas of and highlighting bits and things like that I wanted to then use in articles, and just having sort of a little area that you can compile these and look back at them so you can use them when you need to. So hopefully that'll help. And see you again next time.